back in. Today we're discussing our Week 9 must-start plays at every position. We're going to go through quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. Talk about some of our favorite plays of the week. And we're not going to hit on the most obvious names, the players that you're definitely starting no matter what. So let's go ahead and get to it. We're going to start with the quarterbacks. We're going to start with Daniel Jones versus the Steelers. The Colts and Daniel Jones have arguably the best offense through the first 8 weeks of the season. Jones currently has the third most passing yards, 11th most touchdowns, and the third most rushing touchdowns. He's also been highly efficient, ranking third in EPA per dropback, and owns the fifth highest completion percentage as well. He also ranks fourth in yards per attempt, seventh in fantasy points per dropback, making him a locked-in top 10 quarterback week to week. The good times will keep rolling this week, though, with a phenomenal matchup against the Steelers defense that has allowed 293 passing yards, 1.86 touchdowns, and 23.4 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Daniel Jones is an easy QB1 play for me this week. Let's keep it moving. Let's move over to Caleb Williams versus the Bengals. After a really hot start, Caleb Williams has absolutely face-planted the last few weeks, scoring just 5.7 and 12.8 fantasy points against the Saints and Ravens. Caleb Williams has been wildly inefficient this season, ranking 24th in EPA per dropback and ranking top 5 in turnover throw rate this season. Well, it hasn't been all bad, ranking 11th in yards per attempt, and he has 1,636 passing yards, ranking top 12. He also ranks just outside the top 12 in fantasy points per dropback and fantasy points per game. Now, there were plenty of questions heading into the season with how well Caleb Williams fit this scheme that Ben Johnson runs, and with his poor play, these questions will continue to be asked. While the calls for Tyson Bagent are premature and probably laughable at best, the upcoming matchup against the Bengals should fend off the Caleb Williams haters at least for another week. The Bengals are allowing 262 passing yards, 2.1 passing touchdowns to opposing quarterbacks, and their 20.5 fantasy points per game ranks 7th highest. If Caleb Williams can't turn things around, though, this week, it will be fair to question if he's really the guy moving forward. Either way, I think I do have Caleb Williams a locked-in top 10 quarterback play for me this week against one of the worst defenses in the league. Let's keep moving here. Let's move over to Kyler Murray versus the Cowboys. Things have been rough for Kyler this year and the Cardinals' offense. Murray hasn't topped 220 passing yards or more than 18 fantasy points in any game this year. To make matters worse for him, Jacoby Brissett took over for Murray in 2 games before their bye. And in those 2 games, he averaged 300 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and 20.5 fantasy points per game against the Colts and the Packers. Now, we take a look under the hood for Kyler Murray this year and try to understand what's going on with him. I think, one, he has been very much a short yardage merchant as he ranks 32nd in yards per attempt. He also ranks 24th in red zone pass attempts and 27th in deep ball attempts. For comparison, Brissett ranked 10th in yards per attempt and had just 3 fewer deep targets and 4 fewer red zone attempts in 3 fewer games than Kyler Murray. Much like Caleb Williams, if Kyler can't get things going this week, then he's probably not worth rostering the rest of the year. Now, this matchup against the Cowboys. The Cowboys are allowing 273 passing yards and 2.5 passing touchdowns per game to opposing quarterbacks. Overall, the Cowboys are allowing 26.4 PPR points per game, which is 4 more fantasy points per game than the next closest defense. So this is a phenomenal matchup for Kyler Murray. As long as Kyler Murray plays this week, I think you're probably firing him up. He's a good streaming option if he was dropped in your leagues. But if you can't get things going this week, I don't know what else to say. And it's probably time to move on from Kyler Murray, and he's better left being on the waiver wire. Let's keep moving here. Let's move over to a couple other players that are a little bit more widely available in your league. First, it's going to be Joe Flacco versus the Bears. Now, we will need to monitor Flacco this week ahead of Sunday's game against the Bears. It was reported that Flacco suffered an AC sprain in his throwing shoulder against the Jets. But as long as he's able to go, he set up well to keep the good times rolling this week. Since taking over, he has scored 19, 26, and 24 fantasy points. Next up for the Bengals is a matchup against the Bears that has allowed the 8th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. We're definitely going to need to monitor Joe Flacco this week, but as long as he's able to go, I think Joe Flacco is a really strong play. And then lastly, at the quarterback position, let's talk about Sam Darnold. Now, I feel like a broken record when it comes to Sam Darnold and how well he's played this year. I feel like I've talked about him on almost every one of these videos, but he's available in over 60% of fantasy leagues, and he ranks top 5 in almost every metric we look for quarterbacks. The only real issue for Darnold has been the 29.3 pass attempts per game, which ranks 32nd. This is the main reason he's only averaging 16.3 fantasy points per game, which ranks 20th. On a per dropback basis, he's averaging 0.57 fantasy points per dropback, which ranks top 8 among quarterbacks. So I think fresh off their bye in this road matchup on Monday Night Football against the Commanders defense that has allowed 260 passing yards, nearly 2 passing touchdowns, and the 6th most fantasy points to opposing quarterback, I think Sam Darnold is a pretty strong play, especially with Jaden Daniels looking to return. Should really push the Seahawks to have to throw the ball a lot more, and I think that sets up really well for Sam Darnold. Now, let's move over to the running back position, and we're going to start with Kimani Vidal versus the Titans. since taking over for Marion Hampton, Vidal has been a true workhorse back. He's averaging 16.6 carries, 3.3 targets, and is handling 68% of the snaps. On a per touch basis, he ranks 18th in yards after contact per attempt, 26th in missed tackles forced per attempt, and 8th in explosive run rate. Overall, he is the RB8, averaging 16 PPR points per game. Now, Kimani Vidal has been very good on his short, limited opportunities that he's been given so far. It's kind of funny. Just 3 weeks ago, we were kind of debating whether it's going to be Hassan Haskins or Kimani Vidal. He really put that to bed really quickly. Now, there's also been reports this week that Amari and Hampton may end up missing all the way up until like week 13, week 14. Kimani Vidal is going to continue to be, especially with this workload, a top 15-ish running back, I think, moving forward. And this is a very good matchup against the Titans run defense that is allowing 120 rushing yards, 1.5 touchdowns, 29.2 PPR points per game, which ranks third most to running back. So I think Vidal is an easy top 12 running back play this week. Let's keep it moving. Move over to DeAndre Swift versus the Bengals. Swift has quietly been a top 12 running back this year, averaging 15.9 PPR points per game. He's handling 14.3 carries and 3.4 targets per game, as well as 70% of the total opportunities. On the ground, he ranks 9th in yards after contact per attempt, 4th in explosive run rate, and 28th in missed tackles forced per attempt. Now, through the air, he's also received a healthy 11% target share, ranks 4th in yards per reception and 9th in yards per route run. And this week, he gets a very good matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals, who rank nearly top 5 in pretty much every category to running backs. They're allowing 132 rushing yards per game, which is first, over a touchdown per game to running backs, which is 5th most. And then through the air, 5.38 receptions, 47.1 receiving yards per game, and nearly a half a touchdown per game, which again, all ranked top 5 or bottom 5, however you want to look at it, to opposing running backs. Their 35.1 PPR points per game is easily the most fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. So I think DeAndre Swift is set up really nicely here in this matchup against the Bengals. Now, on the other side of that game, I want to talk about Chase Brown. The season certainly hasn't played out like most of us thought it would. Most of that is due in large part because of Joe Burrow's injury. However, since the Bengals brought in Joe Flacco, we have seen a bit of a turnaround. In the 3 games with Flacco, he's playing roughly 60% of the snaps, running 45% of the routes. He's averaging 11 carries, 3 targets, and averaging 15.6 PPR points per game, which is the RB12 over that span. Obviously, Samaje Perine's involvement has been frustrating, but considering prior to Flacco's, Chase Brown was averaging less than 10 PPRs per game, we will definitely take it. Next up for the Bengals is another home matchup against the Bears. The Bears have allowed the 10th most rushing yards, the 9th most PPR points to running backs. As long as Joe Flacco suits up, Chase Brown should be viewed as a top 15 running back this week. Now let's move over to Tyrone Tracy. Week 9 will be the first week post-Cam Scatterbo. We should expect Tracy to be the feature back of this offense. Last week, once Scatterbo went down, Tracy handled 9 touches compared to just 2 for Devin Singletary. In case you forgot, though, Tyrone Tracy last year on a much worse offense averaged 14 carries, 3.5 targets, 80 total yards, and 14 PPR points per game. I think with how much better this offense is this year, it is a pretty realistic expectation that he can be a pretty solid RB2 on most weeks. Next up for Tracy is a matchup against a very banged up defense and the San Francisco 49ers that have allowed the 12th most PPR points to running backs. I think he's a top 17 running back for me this week. Let's keep moving. Let's talk about Bam Knight. The Cardinals are fresh off their bye, and we had some confusion right out of the gate with them releasing Michael Carter on Monday. Well, it didn't take long for the news to drop that they actually brought him back to their practice squad. It does look like they're going to bring him up from their practice squad, but either way, I expect Bam Knight to handle the lion's share of the touches. Knight averaged 14.5 carries and 3 targets over the last 2 games previous to their bye. Well, it's only resulted in 11 PPR points per game. I think he's a pretty strong RB2 play this week against the Cowboys defense that's all the second most PPR points to running backs. Let's move over to some flex options. First thing I want to talk about is this injury to monitor. Isaiah Pacheco left late in the 4th quarter against the Commanders with what is being called an MCL sprain. He's considered week to week. And with the Chiefs going on bye in week 10, I'd be shocked if he played this week against the Bills. I think Kareem Hunt handles the majority of the touches on the ground and plays most of the 3rd down snaps while Hunt still looks washed. They will continue to feed him with high-value touches. And it's coming off a game last week where he scored 17.2 PPR points. This is a situation to monitor, but if Pacheco misses, fire up Hunt as an RB2 against a Bills defense that has been gashed all year by opposing running backs, and they have allowed the 6th most PPR points to running backs this year. Let's keep moving. Let's move over to Rhamondre Stevenson / TreyVeon Henderson. Rhamondre continually has 75% of the snaps. Only 3, but with only 3 usable weeks. 2 of those were when he found the end zone, and the 3rd is when he saw 5 targets, which hasn't happened since week 2. He's also been really inefficient on the ground. He ranks 47th in yards after contact per attempt, 28th in missed tackles forced, and 38th in explosive run rate. But as long as the Patriots continue to lead on him, he's going to be a viable yet very volatile fantasy asset. Henderson finally broke out last week with 10 carries for 75 yards, but sadly, he fumbled at the goal line. There have been reports that the Pats have been in the market for a running back as well ahead of the trade deadline next week. Not surprising, considering both Pats running backs rank outside of the top 36 in EPA per rush. But as for this week is concerned, they get a very good matchup against the Falcons, who have allowed the 10th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. I think both are viable options, but I lean toward Rhamondre because he's still playing such a high volume of snaps. Keep moving. Let's move over to Tyjae Spears. Now, I'm currently on team free Tyjae Spears right now. It clearly looks like the most explosive running back in the backfield. He's also handled more than 50% of the snaps in 2 of the last 3 weeks. Last week against the Colts, he finished with 12 touches, 82 total yards, and a score for 17.2 PPR points. Spears now becomes one of the best flex options this week, especially against a Chargers run defense that's allowed the 5th most rushing touchdowns and have been gashed on the ground in recent weeks. Spears is a strong RB3 play for me this week. Lastly, I do think Kyle Monangai is also in play. He's been getting more run, more touches in this backfield as well. The Bears really wanted to run the ball and try to protect Caleb Williams, but we'll see what happens, especially if Joe Flacco were to miss. But I think they definitely go super run heavy and where Kyle Monangai and DeAndre Swift are both really solid plays. Emmanuel Wilson is another player I want to hit on. Last week, he had 11 carries, 4 targets, for 87 total yards for 11 PPR points. Now, Josh Jacobs continues to deal with his calf injury. And then we also have to monitor the status of Derek Brown for the Carolina Panthers. And while he matters is because he is a huge part of the Panthers turning around their run defense this year. We saw last week, once he went out early in that game, James Cook went absolutely nuclear against that run defense. That run defense looked like being just as bad as it was last year once he went out. So if Derek Brown misses this week, I really like the Packers' backfield. Emmanuel Wilson has continued to see this type of workload. He's going to be a weekly flex option moving forward. And then lastly, Samaje Perine, who's mixing in about 45% of the snaps, is also in play against the Bears as well. Now let's move over to the wide receiver position. And the first player I want to talk about is Michael Pittman. I just want to start off by saying that the level of disrespect I feel like this season to Michael Pittman is wild. Pittman, who was drafted in the double-digit rounds, is currently the wide receiver 10, averaging nearly 16 PPR points per game. And it feels like every week you just hear everybody talk about Tyler Warren, which rightfully so. Tyler Warren has been an absolute baller. I've also hear a lot of talk about Josh Downs and how and it feels like people are putting Josh Downs ahead of Michael Pittman sometimes. And it doesn't make any sense to me. Michael Pittman is one of the least talked about top 10 wide receivers this year that I've seen. Nobody really brings him up, and he's just kind of there. But, I mean, he currently has 43 catches, 446 receiving yards, and 6 touchdowns. He also ranks top 12 in red zone targets and is 18th in yards after the catch. But all I really want to say is Michael Pittman has been phenomenal this year. And it's been one of the biggest draft day steals we've had of this season, considering where he was taken and how he's produced. So now off my soapbox, the Colts pass catchers, though, this week get an awesome matchup against a Steelers defense that has allowed the second most PPR points to wide receivers this year. So Michael Pittman is once again a top 10 wide receiver for me this week. Let's keep moving. Move over to Zay Flowers versus the Dolphins. Lamar Jackson is actually expected to return this week with a Thursday Night Football matchup against the Dolphins. Zay Flowers has been way more of a wide receiver 2 than the monster wide receiver 1 week he put up in week 1. Flowers does have an awesome 30.6 target per route run rate and is averaging 13.7 PPR points per game, which ranks 24th. He's also been highly efficient, though, ranking 8th in yards after the catch, 10th in yards per route run, and 6th in yards between pass attempt. With Lamar back, Flowers becomes a high-end wide receiver 2 this week against a very bad Dolphins defense. Let's move over to the Jacksonville Jaguars wide receiver. I think both Brian Thomas and Travis Hunter are viable wide receiver 2s this week. Now, the Jags are returning off their week 8 bye, and this is a phenomenal matchup. BTJ sounds like he's trending towards playing this week after suffering a shoulder injury to the Rams in week 7. BTJ returned to practice today, albeit with a red non-contact jersey on today. But either way, him just being back, I think, is a positive sign. And hopefully with the extra time off, BTJ is healthy and resets his mindset because he has been pretty bad all year. And it's not just on Trevor Lawrence. The other news we got was that the Jags plan to utilize Travis Hunter more on the opposite side of the ball. I think both the Jags wide receivers are top 24 wide receivers this week against a Raiders defense that has the 5th most PPR points to the position. Keep moving. Let's move over to Jordan Addison. Since returning from his 3-game suspension, Jordan Addison has been one of the better wide receivers in the league. He's currently averaging 16 PPR points per game, which is 7th among all wide receivers. He's also top 20 in yards per route run and yards per team pass him. Despite missing 3 games, he's already top 7 in red zone targets as well. Now, we have yet to see him play with J.J. McCarthy, who will be under center this week. So there is some level of unknown here, but the matchup is one of the best. The Lions have allowed the 8th most receiving yards, the 2nd most receiving touchdowns, and the 2nd most receiving touchdowns to wide receivers. Overall, they've allowed the 8th most PPR points to wide receivers. I think Addison is a pretty strong wide receiver to play. Keep moving here. Let's move over to Jauan, Jennings. It's been a rough year for all the 49ers wide receivers. Between injuries and poor play, it's been really hard to trust any of them on a week-to-week basis. The last 2 weeks, Jauan Jennings received 14 targets, but hasn't topped 8.5 PPR points. Now, I will say the matchups the last 2 weeks have been pretty brutal against Atlanta and Houston, as those are 2 of the worst matchups for opposing wide receivers. The Falcons allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points, and the Texans allowed the 5th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. However, things changed pretty easily here this week against a matchup against the Giants, who have been brutal against wide receivers. They've allowed the most receiving yards, the 11th most receiving touchdowns, and the 6th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. I do think Jennings could bounce back this week and be a pretty decent wide receiver 3 play against this Giants team. And it does sound like there's a chance that Brock Purdy could return this week. He is getting in limited practice reps again this week, but it does sound like a little bit more positive that maybe Brock Purdy can return. Let's talk about some flex options here. First, I want to mention is Josh Downs. After a rough first 4 weeks, Downs has been a solid source of wide receiver 3 production. He has scored 11 or more PPR points in 3 straight games. As mentioned, with Michael Pittman, the Steelers are off against wide receivers, making Downs a pretty strong flex play this week. Next up, let's talk about Chimere DK. This is more of an opportunity play than anything. DK has posted back-to-back weeks of 16-plus PPR points and has drawn 12 targets. Now, this isn't a great matchup as the Chargers will have the 7th fewest fantasy points opposing wide receivers. However, the Titans consistently are in passing game scripts, meaning there should be plenty of opportunity for DK to have another strong week. DK is a viable flex play this week despite the not-so-great matchup. Next up, let's talk about Jacoby Myers and Trey Tucker. The Raiders are another team fresh off their bye and drawing matchup against the Jags defense that has yielded the 5th most PPR points to wide receivers. I would expect Myers to return to the lineup this week after missing week 7 due to an injury despite practicing in limited fashion prior to being ruled out for the Chiefs game. If the Raiders decide to bench Myers, who is a heavy center of trade rumors ahead of the trade deadline next week, I also think Trey Tucker would emerge as a pretty viable candidate for the flex as well. Now, I do want to mention a couple guys. First is Darius Slayton, who returned last week. Should have had a big day, but had a 70-yard touchdown called back. He finished with 2 catches, 26 yards on 5 targets. But the 49ers do allow the 12th most PPR points to wide receivers. So I think Darius Slayton is kind of a sneaky play. And then if you're kind of desperate, I think Malik Washington, the Ravens allow the 3rd most PPR points to wide receiver. This would be a PPR-only option because I know he scored a touchdown last week, but I would not expect that every single week. But I do think in full PPR leagues, I think he could see, 5 to 7 targets, especially with someone like Darren Waller out. So I think Malik Washington is also kind of an interesting play. Let's keep moving over to tight ends. And we're going to talk about Kyle Pitts first against the Patriots. Despite a quarterback play last week, Kyle Pitts has low-key been a useful fantasy asset this year. He has been a top 12 tight end in 3 of his last 4 games as well and has scored 13 or more PPR points in those 3 games. He's now been targeted 19 times the last 2 weeks, which is extremely encouraging. His 20.6% target share ranks top 5, and is running a route on 91% of dropbacks, which ranks top 3. Next up is a matchup against the Patriots, who allowed the 4th most receiving yards, the 7th most touchdowns, and the 5th most overall PPR points to tight ends. So I think Kyle Pitts is a top 10 tight end for me this week. Theo Johnson, just want to talk about him really quickly. This is a pure volume play, running 100% of the routes. He's also top 4 red zone targets. Should be viewed as a top 16 tight end play against a very beat-up 49ers defense. Next up is going to be Colston Loveland. Now, it wasn't a great day last week where he just had 3 catches for 38 yards and 5 targets, but he did run a season-high 84% of the routes and gets an elite matchup against the Bengals, who have allowed the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. They've already allowed 10 touchdowns to tight ends, and the next closest is 6. Now, there's definitely some volatility here, but with running that many routes in an elite matchup, Loveland is a high-end tight end, too, for me this week. And lastly, I've talked about him the last couple of weeks, but I'll talk about him again, and that's Noah Fant. Now, there's definitely some volatility here. Tight end group in targets and snaps last week. He was 8th in yards per reception, 23.6% target per out run rate, which ranks top 7 among tight ends. Bears allow the 10th most fantasy points to tight ends. So I think Noah Fant, if you're in a pinch, is also a pretty solid play this week. So that being said, if you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comments section below. We'll be sure to get to them. Also, have a great Halloween. Stay safe. We'll see you on the next one. Bye.